shadow people. Silent, lurking figures seen out of the corner of your eye. You've heard about them, but tonight you'll experience what really happens when they cross into your world. Some dismiss them as mere tricks of the mind, yet thousands report sightings. Skeptics like you and me don't believe until they encounter them, and by then, it's too late. The 3 stories you're about to hear are based on real encounters with shadow people. Dark figures that move through the night, feeding on fear, each one more terrifying than the last. These people didn't realize it, but they just stepped into the realm of Mr. Scary Guy. Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal. Ghosts, monsters, and all that nonsense. It was for people who had nothing better to do than scare themselves. I guess you could say I was a skeptic through and through. That was until the graveyard shift at the warehouse. I'd been working at the warehouse for about 6 months. It wasn't the best job, but it paid the bills. The place itself was a sprawling, poorly lit building on the outskirts of town. A couple of times a week, I'd be stuck working the night shift, patrolling the aisles, checking inventory, and making sure nothing was leaking or broken. You'd think a place like that would be boring, and for the most part, it was. At least until the night I first saw it. It was just after 2 a.m., that time when the body is sluggish and your mind starts playing tricks on you. I had just finished a sweep of the loading dock when I noticed something weird. In the farthest corner of the warehouse, just at the edge of where the overhead lights faded into shadow, there was a figure. A tall, unmoving figure. At first, I thought it was just a stack of boxes or maybe some shelving that had been moved, but no, it was too tall and thin for that. I rubbed my eyes, squinting in the dim light, but the figure was still there. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was one of the new guys playing a joke on me. I took a couple of steps forward, ready to yell at them for creeping around. But before I could open my mouth, the figure vanished. No sound, no movement, just gone. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Sleep deprivation, maybe? Stress. Something normal. I laughed it off, but the laugh didn't feel real. With one last glance at the corner where the figure had stood, I walked back to my station and grabbed my clipboard, determined to get on with my work. That night, I didn't see it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. The next night, I was back on shift. I kept telling myself that what I had seen before was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by some stray object. I had almost convinced myself of that when I saw it again. This time, it was closer. The figure stood near the break room door, where the fluorescent lights spilled out into the warehouse. I froze, staring at it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, tall, darker than the surrounding shadows, just standing there. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. There was no answer. I took a step toward it, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The beam sliced through the air, but the light seemed to bend around the figure as though it wasn't really there. My heart pounded, and sweat trickled down the back of my neck. Then, just as before, the figure was gone. 1 second there, the next nothing. I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't normal. I wasn't imagining things. Something was in the warehouse with me. Over the next few nights, the figure appeared again and again, always in the corner of my eye, always standing just beyond the reach of the light. I'd catch glimpses of it near the loading dock or by the long rows of shelves, but whenever I tried to approach, it would vanish. The figure never moved while I watched it. It never stepped closer, but it didn't have to. Each time I saw it, it seemed to invade my thoughts, taking root in my mind until I couldn't think about anything else. I became obsessed with it, searching every corner of the warehouse, trying to catch it in the act. I started having nightmares. In the dreams, the figure wasn't just standing and watching, it was chasing me. No matter how fast I ran, I could never escape it. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the shadow's presence lingering in my mind like a stain I couldn't scrub out. At work, I began to feel it even when I couldn't see it, as if it were hiding just behind me, its eyes, if it had eyes, boring into the back of my skull. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that there was no shadow figure. But every time I turned, I expected to see it standing there. Weeks passed, and my performance at work began to suffer. I was constantly distracted, always looking over my shoulder, expecting the shadow to reappear. My supervisor noticed, but I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding insane. "I'm fine," I'd say, forcing a smile, but inside I was unraveling. One night, I arrived for my shift, and the place was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you could hear the hum of the ventilation system, the distant buzz of the lights, but that night, there was nothing, just silence. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, chalking it up to nerves, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I began my usual rounds, but halfway through, I stopped dead in my tracks. There it was, standing in the middle of the aisle, not at the edge of the shadows, not in the corner of my vision, directly in front of me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was taller than I remembered, its form darker, more defined. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. For the first time I could make out details, vague, unsettling features. A head, broad shoulders, and long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My body refused to move, locked in place by some invisible force. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow shifted, just slightly, but enough to send a jolt of terror through me. I don't remember how I managed to break free, but the next thing I knew, I was running. My feet pounded against the cold concrete floor, the warehouse stretching endlessly before me. I didn't stop until I reached the break room, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I collapsed onto the floor, my hands shaking uncontrollably. For what felt like hours, I sat there, waiting for it to follow. But it never did. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, the figure was gone, leaving only the empty silence behind. The next day, I called in sick. I couldn't face going back there, not after what had happened. But as the days went by, I realized I couldn't keep avoiding it. I needed the job, and more importantly, I needed answers. What was that thing? Why was it haunting the warehouse, and why was it targeting me? Against my better judgment, I returned to work the following week. This time, I came prepared. I brought my phone, determined to capture evidence of the figure. If I could show someone what I was seeing, maybe I wouldn't feel so insane. Maybe there would be a logical explanation. The shift started off normally enough. I went about my rounds, flashlight in hand, phone at the ready. Hours passed with no sign of the figure, and for a moment I began to hope that maybe it was over. Maybe it had left. But as soon as that thought crossed my mind, I saw it. It was standing in the far corner, just like the first time. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others, 3, maybe 4 identical figures, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were watching me. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, but when I lifted it to take a picture, the screen went black. I tried again, but the phone was dead. The lights around me flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch, creeping toward me. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, my eyes never leaving the figures. They were getting closer. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the smooth concrete as I bolted for the exit. I could feel them behind me, their presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't stop until I reached the door, throwing it open and bursting into the cold night air. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The warehouse was silent, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I knew I couldn't go back. Not after that. Whatever those things were, they didn't belong in this world. I quit the next day. My boss didn't ask for an explanation, and I didn't offer one. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, convincing myself that it was over. But it wasn't. Weeks passed, and I started to notice things. Small, subtle things. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, glimpses of figures out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, leftover paranoia from the warehouse. But then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I saw it. The figure was standing in the corner of my room, watching me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as silent and dark as ever. My heart raced, but I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just lay there, frozen in terror as the shadow loomed over me. And that's when I realized the Midnight Watcher had followed me. Now it's always there. Sometimes I see it during the day, just a fleeting glimpse in a mirror or reflection in a window. But at night, it's always closer, always watching. I don't know why it chose me, and I don't know what it wants. All I know is that no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, the shadow is always there. Waiting. I had been on the road for nearly 5 hours when I first saw it. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the highway stretched out in front of me like an endless ribbon of asphalt. I was heading home after a weekend visiting my family in the next state over, a drive I'd made countless times before. It was late, close to midnight, and the only sound was the soft hum of my tires against the pavement and the low drone of a talk radio station playing in the background. The road was empty. No cars behind me, none in front. It was just me, the endless highway, and the shadows cast by my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had at least another hour to go, and the monotony was starting to set in. I tried to shake the growing drowsiness by adjusting the radio and cracking open the window, letting the cool night air rush in. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape at the side of the road. My headlights barely caught it, a figure standing motionless just beyond the guardrail. It was human-shaped, tall and thin, but something about it felt off. Too still. Too dark. I blinked, and for a moment I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my tired mind playing games with me. But as I sped past, the figure didn't move. It stood there, rigid and silent, its face obscured by the darkness. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting it to be gone. But it wasn't. I could still see it, standing exactly where I'd left it. For a long moment, I kept my eyes on the road ahead, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. It had to be nothing, a hitchhiker, or someone whose car had broken down. But why hadn't they flagged me down? Why just stand there, like a statue, watching as I drove past? I pressed down on the accelerator, telling myself not to overthink it. But the image of that figure, dark and unmoving, stayed with me. About 10 miles later, I saw it again. At first, I thought it was déjà vu. The same dark shape standing at the side of the road, unmoving, just beyond the reach of my headlights. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I passed it again, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I couldn't resist looking back in the rearview mirror immediately. The figure was still there. Again, exactly where I had seen it. Except it couldn't be the same figure. I'd driven miles since I last saw it. There was no way it could have followed me. I tried to focus on the road, telling myself that I was just seeing things, that it was probably a coincidence. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me after hours of driving in the dark. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The road stretched on, the empty fields on either side blurring into nothingness. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat. I kept telling myself not to look, but I couldn't help it. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't at the side of the road anymore. It was in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching as I fought to keep control. The figure was right in front of me, standing in the road, blocking my path. I swerved to avoid hitting it, narrowly missing the guardrail as I came to a stop on the shoulder. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a moment, everything was still. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Slowly, I looked up, expecting to see the figure standing in front of my car. But it wasn't there. The road ahead was empty, the highway stretching out into the night as if nothing had happened. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. I could have sworn I had seen it, right there in the road, just seconds ago. But now, it was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the long hours behind the wheel had finally gotten to me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing. But the figure was there again, standing just behind my car. I gasped, whipping my head around to look out the back window. But there was nothing there. The road was empty. My pulse quickened, panic clawing at my chest. I shifted the car into drive and hit the gas, pulling back onto the highway. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, refusing to look in the mirrors again. But even though I couldn't see it, I could feel it. Like a weight pressing down on me. Something dark and malevolent lurking just outside my field of vision. The rest of the drive was a blur. I don't remember how I made it home, only that by the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were trembling and my body was drenched in cold sweat. I sat in the car for a long time, staring out at the empty street, half expecting the figure to be standing there, waiting for me. But there was nothing. I tried to shake off the feeling as I climbed out of the car and made my way inside. I told myself it was just the long drive, the late hour. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. Why had it been standing in the road? Why had it been following me? And more importantly, how had it appeared in front of my car, again and again, miles apart? Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The tall, dark figure, standing motionless in the road, its face hidden in shadow. I woke up several times in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced I had seen something moving in the darkness of my bedroom. But when I looked, there was nothing. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Stress, fatigue, maybe even a trick of the light. But that didn't explain the feeling that had settled deep in my chest, that whatever I had seen, it wasn't over. I didn't drive that night. I couldn't bring myself to get back on the road, not after what had happened. Instead, I stayed in, trying to distract myself with TV and chores. But every time I walked past a window, I felt it. That same weight, like something was watching me. Later that evening, I went outside to get the mail. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. As I stood by the mailbox, rifling through envelopes, I felt a chill run down my spine. Slowly I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. There, across the street, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight, was the figure. I dropped the mail, stumbling backward toward the house. It was watching me, standing still as a statue, just like it had on the road. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and rushed inside, slamming it behind me. I stood there, leaning against the door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What the hell was happening? Why was it following me? I peered through the peephole, half expecting it to be right outside. But when I looked, the street was empty. The figure was gone. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. No matter where I went, I could feel it. An invisible presence lurking just beyond my sight. I avoided driving at night, took different routes to work, but nothing helped. The figure was always there, lurking at the edges of my vision. Then, one night, I saw it again. I was walking home from a friend's place, cutting through a park to get back to my apartment. It was late, the park deserted, and the only light came from the dim street lamps that lined the path. I was almost at the exit when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I turned around, my eyes scanning the darkness. There it was, standing under one of the streetlights, its dark form silhouetted against the light. It was closer this time, close enough that I could see the faint outline of its face, a blank, featureless void. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, as the figure slowly raised its arm, pointing directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stare as the figure took a step toward me. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, sprinting through the park as fast as I could, my lungs burning with every breath. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I don't know how long I stood there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. But I knew one thing for certain: the figure wasn't going to stop. It's been weeks since I last saw it, but I know it's still out there. I can feel it. Every time I look in the mirror, I half expect to see it standing behind me, waiting. I don't drive alone at night anymore. I avoid walking after dark. But no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before the figure finds me again. And when it does, I don't know if I'll be able to escape. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away from the city, a chance for me and my friends to unwind, clear our heads, and get away from all the noise and stress of daily life. Sam, my best friend since college, had found the cabin online. It was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods and isolated from the rest of the world. Just what we needed. There were 4 of us: Sam, his girlfriend Emma, my buddy Jake, and me. We'd been planning the trip for months, all of us excited to spend a few days disconnected from reality. No phones, no internet, no work. Just us, the trees, and the cabin. We set out on a Friday morning, cramming our bags into Sam's SUV. The drive was long, but the excitement kept our spirits high. The roads twisted and turned as we left the city behind, winding through dense forests and hills that stretched on forever. By the time we arrived at the cabin, the sun was already setting, casting a golden glow over the treetops. The cabin itself was small, but cozy. One of those old wooden structures that looked like it had been built decades ago. It had a weathered charm to it, with a wraparound porch and tall windows that overlooked the trees. There was something about the place that felt inviting, despite its isolation. We unpacked quickly, each of us claiming a room. Sam and Emma took the master bedroom, while Jake and I each grabbed one of the smaller rooms down the hall. The cabin had a lived-in feel, with creaky wooden floors, antique furniture, and a large stone fireplace in the living room. It smelled like old wood and dust, but it wasn't unpleasant. Just the kind of scent you'd expect in a place like this. That first night was perfect. We sat around the fireplace, playing cards, drinking beers, and laughing about nothing in particular. The tension of the city melted away as the fire crackled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly relaxed. The sounds of the forest outside added to the tranquility. The rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a distant owl. It felt good to be disconnected from the world, surrounded by friends and nature. It wasn't until late into the night, after everyone else had gone to bed, that I started to feel uneasy. I was sitting alone in the living room, finishing off the last beer of the night, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. At first I thought it was just the firelight playing tricks on me, casting odd shapes across the walls. But as I turned my head, the shadow didn't disappear. It lingered. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The cabin was dimly lit, and the fire had burned down to embers, but I could swear there was something moving just beyond the windows. My heart started to race, and I felt a sudden chill creep down my spine. I got up, walked over to the window, and peered outside. Nothing, just darkness and trees. I stood there for a moment longer, staring into the blackness, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, or the wind blowing the branches. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed, trying to push the unease out of my mind. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. The isolation was getting to me. But that didn't explain the dreams. That night, I dreamt of shadows. They were everywhere, creeping across the cabin, slipping through the windows, crawling up the walls. In the dream, I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching helplessly as the shadows swirled around me, growing darker and more oppressive. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the ceiling, trying to calm myself down. It was just a dream, just a stupid dream. But the next morning, as we gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, I noticed that Jake looked pale and tired. His eyes were bloodshot, and he kept glancing out the windows, as if expecting to see something lurking in the trees. "You all right, man?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. He nodded, but his voice was strained.
"Yeah, just didn't sleep well."
I didn't push it, but I could tell he was rattled. I wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension between us grew. We spent the afternoon hiking through the woods, exploring the trails that wound through the forest. The scenery was beautiful. Tall trees, crisp air, and the distant sound of a babbling creek. But the further we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. It wasn't just me. Emma kept looking over her shoulder, frowning as if she too had sensed something. Even Sam, usually the most laid back of the group, seemed on edge, checking his phone every few minutes despite there being no signal. We returned to the cabin just before dusk, exhausted and uneasy. The forest, which had seemed so inviting in the daylight, now felt oppressive. The trees cast long shadows over the cabin, and the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. That night, as we sat around the fireplace again, the mood was different. None of us were laughing or joking. We were all on edge, our eyes darting to the windows every time a branch tapped against the glass.
"I saw something last night."
Jake finally said, breaking the silence.
"Outside."
We all turned to him, waiting for him to continue. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly.
"I thought it was just an animal at first,"
he said, staring into the fire.
"but I don't think it was. It was tall, too tall to be an animal, and it was just standing there watching."
Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat.
"What do you mean, watching? Like a person?"
Jake shook his head.
"No, not a person. It didn't look right."
A chill ran down my spine, and I exchanged a glance with Sam. He hadn't said anything, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. I hadn't told anyone about the shadow I'd seen the night before. Now, I was starting to wonder if it wasn't just my imagination.
"I'm sure it was nothing,"
Sam said, trying to lighten the mood.
"We're all just tired. This place is creepy, but it's just the woods. Nothing to worry about."
But none of us believed that. We all went to bed early that night, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows again, creeping across the walls, moving closer and closer. I tossed and turned for hours, the unease growing stronger with every passing minute. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know why. I lay there for a moment, listening. The cabin was silent, but something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. Then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside my room. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The footsteps were slow and measured, like someone or something was walking toward my door. I held my breath, listening as they stopped just outside. The door creaked as if someone was leaning against it, and then nothing. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the door to open. But it didn't. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, moving back down the hallway and fading into the distance. I sat up, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know what to do. Should I get up and check? Wake the others? But before I could decide, I heard a soft knock on my door. My blood ran cold. I got out of bed, moving slowly and quietly, and crept to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, hesitating. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see what was on the other side. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door just a crack. The hallway was empty. The shadows were long, stretching across the wooden floor, but there was no one there. No sign of anyone or anything. I stepped into the hallway, my heart racing, and made my way toward Jake's room. I needed to know if he had heard it too. But when I reached his door, I found it wide open, the room empty. His bed was unmade, the blankets tangled on the floor, but Jake was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through me, and I rushed to the other rooms, banging on the doors. Sam and Emma stumbled out, looking groggy and confused. "Jake's gone," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something's in the cabin." We searched the cabin from top to bottom, calling Jake's name, but there was no sign of him. The door to the porch was unlocked, and when we stepped outside, we found footprints leading into the woods.
Where the hell did he go?
Sam muttered, his face pale.
We have to find him.
Emma said, her voice shaky.
What if? What if he saw something? What if he's hurt?
We grabbed flashlights and followed the footprints into the woods, the beams cutting through the darkness as we stumbled over roots and rocks. The forest felt different now. Darker, more sinister. The trees loomed overhead like twisted shadows, and the wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a low, eerie sound. We called Jake's name, but there was no answer. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to shift and move just beyond the reach of our flashlights. And every now and then, I thought I saw something. Just a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Finally, we reached a clearing, and that's when we saw him. Jake was standing at the edge of the clearing, his back to us, staring into the trees. For a moment, relief washed over me, and I called his name, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, like he hadn't heard me at all. We rushed over to him, but as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. It was like he was in a trance, his eyes fixed on something in the distance.
Jake?
Sam grabbed him by the shoulder and shook him, but Jake didn't react. He just stood there, his face blank, his skin pale as the moonlight filtered through the trees. Then, slowly, Jake turned to face us, and that's when we saw the shadow behind him. It was huge, towering over him, its form twisting and writhing like smoke. It had no face, no features, but its presence was overwhelming. Dark, oppressive, suffocating. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, and I took a step back, my legs trembling.
Run!
Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We never found out what happened to Jake that night. After that weekend, none of us spoke about it again. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still feel it. The shadow. Watching. Waiting. 3 stories of shadow people. 3 encounters that left people haunted long after they thought they escaped. Whether you believe in them or not, shadow people are real to those who have seen them. And once they set their sights on you, there's no way to turn back. Comment below if these stories sent chills down your spine, or if you've had an encounter of your own. And remember, when the shadows seem to move, don't look too closely. Because sometimes, they move for a reason. This is Mr. Scary Guy signing off, saying, sleep tight if you dare. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe by clicking the icon above. We've also got a playlist full of scary stories on your left side, and a suggested video you'll love on the right. Choose one, and keep the scares going.